Welcome to the World Wanderers Podcast, episode number 36. I'm Ryan.
I'm Amanda.
And we're your hosts.
That's my line. Today we're talking about identity and how identity can shift or change through traveling.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest things I noticed about traveling is a change in how I view myself and how I define myself.
Yeah,
Maybe
definitely.
Coming from a view of defining myself to just being comfortable, being a mystery.
You're such a mystery. Just such a closed book that people are just waiting to read. But seriously, do you want to start by perhaps defining identity to our audience? In case anyone's a bit
identity
confused.
is like your self-conception or your conception of others. So it's...
As defined by Wikipedia.
Yeah. A person's conception or expression of their own or others' individual or group affiliations.
So that's referring to either self-identity or national identity, which are two topics that we're going to be touching on today.
Yeah, because I found identity is kind of a concept that's dependent on people being around you. Like
yeah, external factors and influences.
Because if you're just sitting by yourself, you do have a self-conception, a view of yourself, but...
Perhaps you would identify yourself as a loner? A lone wolf, one might say.
A one-man wolf pack. Or someone who's not very good at humor.
I'm hilarious. You just don't know it yet.
But so one of the things that's cool about traveling is you start to notice that your identity or what your pseudo-identity, I guess maybe, is like changing because of the situation you're in. And you start to think about, oh, why am I trying to present this as my identity if it's dependent on the people around me?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. If I think about myself coming out of high school and going into university, I really took on the identity as somebody who was, a big partier. I liked to go out. I liked dancing. I liked to have fun. I was also really studious, and I kind of carried that through university with me, and then was able to kind of step away from those labels or judgments that I put on myself through university, through traveling. If
someone asked you who you were in university, what would you say?
Well, I was still Amanda. That doesn't change. That's my name. So there's things about me that don't change as my identity. So I identify myself as somebody who grew up in Cochrane. I identify myself as a business student, as a Canadian, but I also identified myself as like a party girl, I guess you could say. Socialite. I was extroverted. Those are all things that I attached my identity to. Hard worker, studious. What about you?
For me in university, I'd say we went to university in Alberta, so part of my identity was being from BC, being some different, being a Vancouver Canucks fan, being a business student.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of like the three main things I think about now as being things that really used as my identity.
Yeah, and I think too that actually, there were so many people at the university who were from BC who identified with being, British Columbian or being from Vancouver, being a Vancouver Canucks fan. And I really took on the identity of being a Calgary Flames fan. Even though, if we're being honest, I really didn't care that much about the Calgary Flames pre-university. I went to the games occasionally. It was the team I cheered for because it was the closest city that I lived in, but I wasn't, maybe I hadn't stuck that sticky on my face for everyone to see.
Mm-hmm. It's like there's certain roles that are available for you to fill easily. So I think when you are young, it's hard to have a conception of I guess, I don't know. It's a tricky subject to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we're talking about it. But for me, I feel like me latching on to defining myself and who I was based off where I was born, based off where I grew up, based off a hockey team I cheered for, based off the school I went to. They're things I use to fill a hole of where my identity should have been.
Yeah.
Like, I don't feel good about, because I think the identity is kind of like your actions and your aspirations, your thoughts. You're the way you view the world is kind of like what your really identity is. But if you aren't confident in any of that stuff, there are these things available for you to grab onto and attach your identity to.
Mm-hmm.
And sports is a big one, especially for guys, because you can get this kind of like fulfillment out of it. Like if you attach your identity to a sports team and I'm a fan of this team, I'm part of this tribe. And then when that tribe does better than a different team's tribe, you can say, oh, I'm better than these people because my team's better than those people.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take a step back, you're like, I have nothing to do with this.
It's very Survivor-esque, the word tribe. I think about that.
Yes, they use the word tribe on Survivor.
The tribe has spoken. You're out. I was just going to relate that conversation to Survivor, but I'm just not going to go there, actually. Just changed my mind. Yeah, no, that's definitely a thing. Like, I feel like as you kind of grow and blossom from a child to an adolescence to an adult, you really are kind of almost walking blindly, just grabbing onto what you can. And it's, tangible, I guess intangible, but kind of tangible things like, oh, the sports team. Oh, that makes up who I am. Like, I like this sport. I'm a hockey player, a baseball player. In high school for me, it was, I'm a dancer. And then, the people who were dancers sort of kind of fit into this, like, oh, those are the popular girls group. And it was like, oh, the hockey players are cooler than the football players. And it was kind of all these small identities in these like bigger groups. And society does really kind of break off into these, I guess, tribes, you could say.
Yeah. It's like it starts from an other people point of view. Like when you're looking at the world, it's nice to look at it in terms of like well-defined things. Oh, this person is a that. This person is a this. And then I like people, when you're young, you don't know who you are, but there's a lot of, like, you can never really know who you are. You can't really know yourself.
No, life is about getting to know yourself, which is pretty cool. Since you're this like soul in this physical self, you're still getting to know that person.
And when you don't know yourself and there's all these people around telling you who you are, oh, you're a good student, you're a good athlete, you're a dumbass, you suck at math, you're a fatty, you're a whatever.
You kind of take those on,
and it's like you never chose those things. People just put that on you, but it's easy to take that on as part of your identity.
And it's kind of interesting because that sort of, you come out of high school with this identity that's sort of been put on you by your peers, your family, your friends in that situation. And then, if you choose to go away to university where people don't know you, it kind of opens that door to re-identify yourself. You walk into a situation where people don't know. It's like, oh, okay, well, I was unpopular in high school because I was in band. I was a band geek. It's like you can walk into university and you can decide to be whoever you want to be to these new people, which is kind of the interesting thing about identity, because in each changing situation, you can kind of rebuild or recreate that identity for yourself. or your external influences can put a different identity on you, which is sort of the interesting thing about identity. How do you think that your identity sort of shifted? You kind of talked about what it was, how you identified yourself, and maybe others identified you in university, and how did that shift going traveling?
Well, it's funny because I think before leaving university and going traveling, I had thought about, because I would go home to BC in the summer and come back to Calgary in the winter to go to university. And I remember realizing that, like, when I'm home, I like to identify myself as going to university in Alberta, like maybe being more of like trying to take on like those Alberta things. Like I just try to separate myself from my peers there by being like, oh yeah, I live in Calgary, I'm cool. And then when I go to Calgary, it's like, oh, I'm from BC. Like, don't worry, guys, I'm cooler than you.
Don't worry, guys.
No, but like that's
Ryan's in the house.
But it's like I think it was like a trick of me trying to make myself feel different for sure. And I think when you're trying to make yourself feel different from people, that's really, you're trying to make yourself feel better than people.
Yeah, and make yourself feel special in a way. That definitely resonates with me, because even going between, the 30-minute drive between Cochrane and Calgary, it's like when I got together with my friends from high school, it's like, oh, like I'm a Calgarian now. But then when it's in Calgary, it's like, oh, you're from Calgary, right? No, I'm from Cochrane. Like really making that, like, it's different. It's a different thing.
Yeah.
Like distinguishing that.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to make yourself feel different. So I think going traveling, like you have opportunities to take on a national identity when you're inside a country, mostly around sports. It's kind of like sanctioned nationalism, or like the Olympics happen and your teams are competing and you're like, oh, we're Canadian. These people who I don't know, who live in very far away places, are confined in the same like extortion racket as me. So I should cheer for them. But it's kind of abstract. But like when you leave the country, then I guess people are telling you more like, oh, you're Canadian. You kind of identify with your national identity more.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, I've said this numerous times in the podcast. Like one of the things that I really love about traveling is arriving in a city where nobody knows you and you can kind of really create an identity of your own. And that only goes so far, because you take your passport with you. At no point do you get to leave behind that national identity. And it becomes something that you talk about almost every day when you're traveling. It's one of the first questions that people ask. It's where did you come from? Where have you been? Oh, where are you from? And it's like, oh, I'm from Canada. And oftentimes you don't even get people's names. It's just like, oh yeah, like I'm going for dinner with the Canadian couple, or like the Canadians are going to come with us. And you just become your national identity. And it's really easy to get wrapped up in, oh yeah, like I'm Canadian.
So what do you mean get wrapped up in that?
I guess for me, obviously I'd always been like, oh, I'm Canadian. My parents kind of ingrained into me like, oh, you should be thankful you were born in Canada. It's a really great place to be born and brought up in. Canadians have this passport where you can travel almost anywhere in the world very easily. Like you're very fortunate to be Canadian. But other than that, it was kind of, I cheered for Team Canada at the Olympics. I celebrated Canada Day. And other than that, I didn't live my day-to-day life being quote unquote Canadian. It wasn't something day to day, because I'm surrounded by all these other people who hold that same identity characteristic as myself. And then traveling, I felt like everyone we met was like, oh, sweet, you're Canadian, you're Canadian, you're Canadian. And it was just constantly sort of in my face. And I feel like I got wrapped up in the stereotypes that are put on Canadians.
So what are the stereotypes, or like what are the generalizations people make about Canadians?
I think that a lot of people think that we're really humble. Canadians are so nice. You guys are the nicest people.
Do you think those are things people think, or those are things that Canadian people, like those are things you definitely hear from Canadians a lot about. Like Canadians are like really eager to generalize Canadians when they're traveling.
Yeah, I don't really know. I feel like it's a what came first, the chicken or the egg thing, and I don't really know what came first. Was it other people, did one person say, "Oh, I met this Canadian, they were super nice," and that's how it started? Or was it, oh, like, did it come from the wartime and it's like, oh, we were kind of neutral, like we're so nice. Like we're not America, like we're so nice. I don't know the answer to that. Like if it was other people putting that on us or us putting that out to the rest of the world. But I do know that traveling, people were like, they'd be like, they would say things such as, oh, thank God you're not American, or, oh, I'm really glad you're Canadian, or, oh, I love Canadians. And in my head, I'm thinking, there's just this fake line between us. Had I said, oh, I'm from Montana, you just dismiss me like I'm not a human because I'm American and I hold a different passport?
Yeah, that's kind of my experience. Kind of is maybe I got a better sense of identity. That's kind of a weird thing to say because it doesn't really mean anything. But like,
yeah, I don't really understand what you mean by that.
I don't know what I stand by mean by that. I just wanted to like put some sort of reasoning for why my perspective changed. But my perspective changed from at first going traveling and people were like, find out you're Canadian, and they're like, oh, we thought you're American, this is awesome that you're Canadian. Like they have a positive reaction to finding you're Canadian instead of American, and me feeling good about that at the time. Like when we first went, like, oh, it's awesome that they think I'm better because I'm Canadian. Because I'm Canadian. Canadians are better. Like that, or something like that. Maybe that was my logic. To shifting to when someone would have that reaction to you, like, oh, we thought you're American, it's so good that you're Canadian. And it's like, I start to come to think like, okay, this person now has like a different perception of me, but like I haven't changed at all.
Yeah.
So maybe they were thinking negative thoughts about me, about things they had no idea about. And then nothing's changed with me other than they know now where I'm from. But that's completely different too. And it's like Canadians maybe have accepted these generalizations and these stereotypes because usually they're more positive about us than other people. But it's still the exact same thing. It's like, oh, American people are abrupt, and the negative characteristics and generalizations people make about them, that's the exact same thing. It's just we get the positive side, so we're more eager to take it. And it's still the same thing because like when you're generalizing about people, you're separating them, kind of trying to make it seem like we're not just all people. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what gives rise to the idea of certain groups of people are like subhuman, and a lot of like atrocities committed because of that similar logic.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting, like traveling and being fully in this like Canadian identity thing. I really I know I said it before, but I can get wrapped up. So then somebody's like, oh, you're Canadian? Like, you're so nice. And I'm like, yeah, I am nice. And it's like, oh, Canadians are so nice. And I'm like, oh yeah, we're amazing. And I'll say things like, yeah, everyone apologizes to each other. Like you bump into somebody in the grocery store, or somebody bumps into you in the grocery store, and like, I apologize to them. But then when I'm home, it's like, I'm walking through the grocery store and somebody bumps me, and like, I'm like, what are you doing? I'm standing here. Don't bump into me. And I'm thinking negative things about this person. And so it's such a different perspective. I guess it's such a shift in that view of Canadians and that identity as Canadians. Because I just take people at face value when I'm in it. I'm not like, oh, you're Canadian, like you're nice. You must not have meant to cut me off while we were driving. I'm like, no, you're a dick. You just cut me off. Do you know what I mean?
I think so. I think I understand what you're talking about. Like your like thoughts about Canadians while you're traveling, and you're like able to talk to people and generalize these things. But then when you come home, you don't think about that at all.
Yeah, and the first time we traveled, because it was my first experience with like this positive, oh my gosh, you're Canadian, I love you, you're so nice. I was like, ooh, people like me because I'm Canadian. I mean, it's hard not to enjoy that. Like everybody likes to have their tires pumped up a little bit, have their bucket filled with a little bit of positiveness. But when you start thinking about it, it is very much like, well, what were you going to think about me if I turned around and was like, oh, I'm British, I'm Australian. I don't sound British or Australian, but I'm American. You know, like this, like, phew, I thought you were American thing is so weird to me because we're all people and we're so much more than what our passport says.
Yeah. And so like when you think about what do you have in common with other Canadian people?
My passport. I mean, it depends on the person, really. There are some people that I have lots in common with, you know, people who like the same things as me or who have the same values as me. I have a lot in common with, but there's also people who I have nothing other than we have the same logo on our passport.
Yeah, like you probably have something more in common with someone from Montana than someone from Southern Ontario.
Perhaps,
or
yeah.
for sure Quebec, New Brunswick.
Did you just put a stereotype on Quebec people?
Not a stereotype, but it's just...
No, for sure. And
they're...
I've had really instant connections with people from other places in the world. Like I have, you know, Rory, who we had on the podcast, is a friend from Australia who I connected with instantly and who I've kept that connection with. And I feel like I have more in common with him than a lot of people in Canada.
And that's the thing too, like thinking that your commonality is defined by your geography. Like you're going to have things in common with a certain percentage of people everywhere. And maybe that percentage changed. Like maybe now that we live here in Canmore, there's people I meet at least more people in like a similar life stage and I have more in common with them. But, you know, other cities you go to, people are going to be more and have things in common with me too. I'm sure someone every place has like at least something we can connect on.
Yeah, 100%. It's kind of interesting coming back from traveling the first time because you and I got, you know, I guess I call them our like big kid jobs, but we started working in offices. And once again, I found myself sort of shifting my identity. So it shifted from being Canadian, because that no longer makes me different from these people that I work with, to being a traveler. It's like, oh, well, I really like to travel. Like I'm a traveler. I spent the last 6 months traveling. I have all these friends who are travelers. Like travel.
Yeah. So like, you've been traveling, you're Canadian, you're maybe some other things. It's like you share this in common with travelers, that you're all traveling. Like that's what you have in common. But then when you're in that group, you're trying to separate yourself. And then you're not really like, oh my God, we're all travelers, this is awesome, while you're traveling. But then you go home and then your identity, you're not like, oh hey, we're all Canadian, this is awesome. You go to like, oh, I'm a traveler. Like no one else here has like traveled as much as me.
Yeah. No, for sure. And it's interesting how that shifts. And then seeing that shift from working that office job and then traveling again, it's sort of, I identified more with like I'd had this professional career and I fully took on that identity, like wearing pencil skirts and blouses and going for drinks after work and, you know, carrying a nice bag because a backpack's not cool on the sea train when you're wearing a skirt, and kind of fully diving into this high level professional work identity and then going traveling and kind of carrying a bit of that with me. It's like adopting that Canadian thing again, but being like, oh, well, like I worked here and did this and that's what makes me different than you. Do you know what I mean?
So like when we went traveling this past time,
yeah,
like you're what were your main identity characteristics then?
Well, I mean, Canadian, again, obviously, adopted that national identity, but I think more of like, oh, like I was a business professional. Like I had a big girl job.
Mm-hmm. It makes you think about self-esteem. I think self-esteem is wrapped up in identity because self-esteem is kind of like your self-conception.
Yeah.
But my experience was kind of feeling really bad about myself, having low self-esteem, but trying to trick myself into feeling good about myself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like when you're comparing yourself to others, you want to make yourself feel better than other people. You want to make yourself feel different and better. Different when you're comparing is usually always better.
Yeah.
Versus having an internal sense of self-esteem where you're not really worried about, you're not playing this game where it's like, oh, I'm different because of this, this, and this.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like as I've worked more on my self-esteem recently and over this past trip we took, that game kind of just like disappeared out of my head.
Yeah.
Where I was instead of looking to differentiate from myself from people who are like, have these things about being Canadian or being a business graduate and like a former office worker, into looking for things you connect with people.
Yeah, for sure. I was just thinking about how it's interesting with identity because you can kind of like pick and choose things that you want people to know about yourself. And I was thinking, as we were saving money for South America on top of my office job, I served once a week for just a few months. And when I was there, you know, people would ask me questions like, how busy does this place get? You know, do you make good money, et cetera, et cetera. And I would always be on the defense with it, where I'd be like, oh, well, like, I'm not really sure. I just work here once a week. I'm, you know, this title at this company. This is what I actually do. You know, I'm just saving for something really important. And I refused to take on waitress as part of my identity. Like I refused to have that label put on me, even though that's what I was doing at that point. Do you know what I mean?
No, absolutely. Because if you're really worried about what people think about you,
mm-hmm.
And you've got this view of the world about like who's better than who, you don't want people to think that you're a waitress.
Yeah, and I feel like people do the same thing with maybe like exercise and fitness. I feel like a lot of people who are not that interested in exercising feel like they want to have that as part of their identity. Like, oh, I'm fit. Like, oh, I practice yoga. Like, I'm a yogi. They want to put that label on themselves. I feel like they don't want to have the labels like, oh, I do nothing. I'm lazy. Do you know what I mean? Even if, you know, if your interests don't align with lifting weights or practicing yoga, that's fine. You don't have to have that. Maybe you like to ski or, you know, just do something small. You don't have to be an extreme athlete, but I feel like there's this societal pressure to fit into these groups and be these people that maybe we're not.
Because I think people, like, it's really complex, right?
Oh, it's extremely complex.
Like, people like to view things as black and white, good or bad, right or wrong. But it's like, okay, like who you are is constantly in flux. Mm-hmm. Like some days you're doing more exercise, eating healthy. Some days you don't eat healthy. Some days you take positive actions. Some days you take negative actions.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, you know, you don't have to stick this label on yourself because you're one thing or another. It is hard. Like there's so many external forces that put that on you. People will say these things like, oh, you're this or you're that. And then it gets in your head, or you'll say that about yourself and say that to somebody else. And then they'll turn around and say it as well because you said it. And it makes it difficult. Traveling in South America, I think, I don't know at what point it was, maybe like 3 months in, we sort of talked about like this national identity, and we're able to sort of try and find more of an authentic self, less based around what our passports said, or, you know, what our friends at home had said, or what our coworkers said, what our families had told us.
Yeah, I think for me, I remember we were away for the Olympics, and the last time the Olympics happened in 2010, I got like really into the hockey tournament and really into cheering for Team Canada. But like, there's always kind of this nagging doubt when you're a fan of a sports team and really emotionally invested in it that year, like really have nothing to do with it. And it's like, it seems weird to be emotionally invested in something you have nothing to do with.
Yeah, it's a bit strange. Like, if you were to think of yourself as like an alien who just flew down in a little pod and like exited your little spaceship on Earth, and you're like, why are these people crying over this? Like, these people that they don't know, over this thing that they don't do. Because why are they all wearing the same thing? Like, it seems really weird.
Yeah,
it's such
like
a huge part of society. Like, we're so deep in it that it's really hard to pretend that you're that little alien. But if you think about it, it's really weird.
Yeah, it's bizarre. But like, yeah, it's hard to give up. Like, you're like, okay, yeah, I know it's kind of dumb. It's irrational. The concept of like really putting a lot of time and energy into something that has no impact. Like, I'm just going to sit on the couch and watch the game and, you know, be so emotionally invested and like maybe even get like superstitious. It's really strange. But I think was fighting with this idea of like, okay, yeah, it's kind of dumb, but like it gives me a partial sense of fulfillment because I didn't feel good about myself. Like, I didn't like myself. I didn't feel like I was accomplishing anything. I didn't. Yeah, I guess I guess there's like kind of, you have a couple identities. You have the identity like with what you think of yourself, and the identity of what you want others to think of you, or like who you are.
Yeah, and then I think that there's also different people see you in different ways. And I think that they kind of put their image of you on you. And sometimes it's easy to get kind of taken away by that as well, especially if it's positive. Like, if somebody says, you know, this thing that you did really inspired me, it's like, ooh, I'm inspiring.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of, there's a study about people who were playing Monopoly, and they gave, I think, one person at every table double the money to start with. It would double the money to start with, or maybe double the money every time they passed go. Mm-hmm. So these people who were getting double the money, I think it was every time they passed go, obviously have way more money, can buy more things, and they win the game almost all the time. But then people had to rate themselves at the end of the game about how good they thought they were at Monopoly. And these people who were getting double the money rated themselves as really good Monopoly players. And I think it's like, when you don't know who you are and you feel uncertain about yourself, maybe you don't like yourself, like fundamentally deep down, it's easy to attribute things to yourself. Like, it's kind of just human nature to attribute these things, like, oh, I'm good at Monopoly. I'm a good Monopoly player because it has nothing to do with me, but I think I'm good at it.
Yeah, definitely.
Instead of maybe if you're like, because it scares you to say like, oh, I'm no better. It's just luck. That's the only reason I won. Like, it has nothing to do with me. Maybe if those people, it'd be funny to see that study with like people who have been defined as high self-esteem versus low self-esteem, because I really think that when you do have a lower conception, you're really like desperate to grab onto things, and you're afraid to admit that these bad things were your fault, or that these good things had nothing to do with you. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why, like, to tie it back to the national thing, for me at least, I didn't feel good about myself. And there's like these national characteristics you can take on, just only really relevant while you're traveling, but then like different things when you're at home. But then I think traveling really gives you an insight, because a lot of these characteristics are dependent upon the people around you. Like, you're constantly change when you're in the same social group. It's easy to have your role and have your identity and be like, oh, I'm the joker and I'm the person from BC, and these are the things that make me different and unique and like somewhat necessary in this group of people because I have this role.
Yeah.
But when the group's constantly changing, you realize that it's kind of ridiculous because it's like you don't need to have a role.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because the second time we traveled to South America, I kind of felt that Canadian identity thing happening all over again, similar to the way it happened when we traveled the first time. And then like the further that we got on, I felt as though I was really starting to discover myself, and I was able to distinguish myself outside of this I'm Canadian thing. Does that resonate with you? Like starting to find what I would define as like authentic self or true self, or, you know, increasing self-esteem and being able to separate from this, see like national identity for what it is and be able to define myself in a different way.
But what do you think was doing that, or like making that happen?
What do you mean? What was doing it?
Like, why do you think you were separating yourself from those nationalistic ideas?
I think just having a better sense of value in myself, or a better image of myself. And I was like, yeah, like I'm from Canada. That's not really like who I am though. Like, do you want to know something else about me? I'm pretty cool. I guess more confidence in myself, like getting more enjoyment out of the things that interested me. And I feel like for me, South America was really about finding sort of the things that I was passionate about. I'd really lost that working for 2 years. I just didn't really spend any time doing the things that I actually care about because I was so consumed by being this hard worker, really good at my job, really focused on that person. What about you?
Yeah, and I think it's like when you're traveling, you have less worries about what people think about you.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's kind of like if you don't like me, then see you never.
I think
basically.
Yeah, I think that's like a bit of the fuel that drives you to take on these identity roles.
Is
perhaps?
that people will see you again? Do you mean, or?
It's just like maybe you're more worried about what people think about you.
When they see you all the time?
Not necessarily. Like, yes, when you see people all the time and you work in a work setting, and so you have to care about what people think about you because like they could fire you or they could give you bad reviews.
Yeah.
But there's also, you can have situations where you'll never see people again, where you care about what they think and where you don't care about what they think.
Yeah. So how did travel for you help you figure out your like true identity, or help you identify with somebody who you really want to be?
Well, I remember, like, I think it's just like almost like a repetition thing where you hear people generalizing Canada over and over and over and over and over again. Like you hear other Canadians talking about how like wonderful Canada is, or you hear people like, oh, Canadian people are so nice. Canadian people are so nice. And I'm like, I know that's not true. Like there's tons of Canadian people. And it's like at first maybe you go along with it because it feels nice to say like, oh, I'm Canadian. Think Canadians are nice. Think I'm nice. This is great. But then it just like over and over and over again, you're like, okay, guys, like
it's like a record on repeat.
Like there's like tons of dick Canadians. Like there's tons of nice Canadians. There's tons of nice Americans. We shouldn't be defined by these like administrative units that have like designed some sort of flag and created an anthem and created a fence around us and have the right to like take our money, but like that's the only thing we have in common as Canadians versus Americans.
It's kind of interesting too, because I feel like one of the reasons that people generalize Canadians as nice is I think that there's a lot of passiveness in the way our culture does things. It seems like we're not and this is perhaps a generalization as well, it seems like a lot of people are very, very passive. Sort of passive the way we do things, passive the way we communicate. It's really seldom that I feel like I meet somebody who's really in my face assertive. And it's almost hard not to be like, where are you from?
Yeah.
Who are you?
Traveling, you can kind of like pick out when people ask people to take photos, you can pick out German people because they're always like really specific about, okay, I'm just doing the generalizing, but like a lot of German people seem to be very assertive about getting what they want when other people take their photos for them. And like, I remember kind of being taken aback by that at first and thinking it was a negative thing and thinking it was a good thing that Canadians are so nice, quote unquote, but realistically just passive.
Yeah.
Like I remember we asked someone to take our photo and they're like not actually taking a photo. They're just like can't figure out how to take a photo on camera. And we're just like going to pretend like it was a fine.
Like he's like giving us a thumbs up and we're like, yeah, it's fine. Like, and then I think we just took a selfie ourselves. And also too, when we were at Temples of Angkor, we're standing in front of Angkor Wat, like this crazy cool attraction. And we asked this guy to take a picture of us and he doesn't even get Angkor Wat. He just takes it of us. Like we're covering it. And instead of being like, excuse me, can you take another one where we can see this? Now we literally don't have a photo together with Angkor Wat because we were passive.
Yeah. And so like when you're passive, you don't want to upset that other person. So people maybe think of you as nice, but inside of that is like not a nice thing. When people are too passive to get what they need and don't feel like they're can go out and ask for what they need, or you have a person who expects other people to meet their needs.
Yeah.
And that's not a nice person.
Yeah. This is kind of just like the surface of a really deep philosophical.
You can tell we're qualified to be delving into these matters.
Philosophical topic. I'm super interested to hear any listeners out there, your opinions or thoughts on identity shifting with travel, as well as national identity. You can shoot us an email at theworldwanderspodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, it seems like by no means have we been able to package this up nicely. It's like kind of one of those things where you start thinking about and you end up with more questions than
just like down the rabbit hole. Do you have anything else you want to touch on before we sign off?
No, I'd love to hear from anyone who has thoughts if they want to shoot us an email or leave a comment on our show notes for this episode.
Yeah. As always, go traveling, get out there, do your thing. Don't tell Canadians they're nice if they're not being nice to you. Yeah. And just be hesitant to accept or dole out generalizations. Yeah. And to all you Americans out there, don't accept people telling you you're mean. If you feel like you're nice, you tell them what's up. Yeah. I think like it's especially like if you're from somewhere where there's like positive generalizations made of you, like those are the exact same things as negative generalizations. They're just the other end of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. It's still not a good thing that people are willing to say, you know, I know everything, not everything, but like people think they know a ton about you and can put you in a box because they know where you're from. For sure. And that's not a good thing. You should get to know people on a deeper level than that. Definitely. So check out the show notes at www.theworldwanders.com. And like we said, shoot us an email if you want to talk further about identity. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening.